Welcome to Conspiracy Files. I'm your host, Zoe Parker, and in today's episode, we venture into a world forgotten by mainstream history, a world erased, some claim, by design. The mystery of Tartaria isn't just about a lost civilization. It's a doorway into a global cover-up, a puzzle made of maps, architectural anomalies, and rewritten timelines. Is it a fringe fantasy, or have we been taught a history designed to conceal the truth? Stay tuned. Tartaria, or Tartary as it was often called on old maps, wasn't just a label scribbled across the vastness of Central Asia. It was a reflection of how Western powers perceived and misunderstood entire regions beyond their reach. The term appeared frequently in 16th to 19th century cartography, applied broadly to an immense, ill-defined territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to Siberia, from the Arctic Circle to parts of northern China. But over time, it faded, and in its absence, questions began to rise. This disappearance did not occur in a vacuum. The 19th century was a time of aggressive empire building, with both Western Europe and Russia carving up territories, imposing borders, and asserting historical narratives that aligned with their political goals. As the Russian Empire expanded eastward and absorbed much of what had been labeled Tartary, maps changed. Histories changed. The idea of a vast, independent culture spanning centuries and thousands of miles was steadily overwritten by narratives of barbaric tribes, nomadic peoples, and empty wilderness. Tartary, once a staple on maps and in encyclopedias, became a footnote. Then, not even that. Western Europe's colonial projects mirrored this rewriting. As new lands were charted and conquered, indigenous histories were often erased or reframed. The uncivilized label served a purpose: to justify domination. In that context, the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, texts, and official narratives begins to look less like a natural evolution of scholarship and more like a carefully guided omission. Culturally, the Enlightenment played its role. As science and rationalism took center stage in Europe, there was a push to standardize knowledge. The diverse and often conflicting records of older times, like those that referenced Tartary, were seen as unreliable, even embarrassing. The move toward a unified, Eurocentric view of history meant discarding anomalies, inconsistencies, and unexplained civilizations. The idea that a massive, organized society could have existed outside the traditional centers of civilization and left behind so little was inconvenient. And so it was pushed aside. Meanwhile, in the East, Russia was asserting itself as a modern empire. Part of that process involved dismantling the stories of the peoples it had conquered. What better way to solidify power than to absorb a land not just physically, but historically? Over time, the Tartars, once recognized as a vast, varied population, were fragmented into smaller ethnic groups, each with their own label, their own rewritten history. Tartary the empire became Tartary the myth. And myths, as we know, don't just vanish. They linger in the margins of dusty manuscripts, in unexplained architecture, in ancient maps that contradict modern narratives. They wait, and for those who stumble upon them, they whisper a dangerous question. What else have we been taught to forget? Among the most intriguing aspects of the Tartaria mystery are the figures and events that seem to linger just beyond the borders of accepted history, obscured not by lack of evidence, but by the gradual erasure of their significance. These individuals and occurrences, often dismissed or recontextualized by mainstream historians, become pillars of the Tartarian conspiracy for those who believe in its hidden truth. One of the central figures frequently invoked is Marco Polo. In his 13th century writings, he refers to Tartary as a vast region filled with powerful rulers, grand cities, and customs unknown to the West. His accounts speak of Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who ruled over an empire stretching from Eastern Europe to the Sea of Japan. While mainstream history ties this period exclusively to Mongol conquest, Tartaria believers suggest that Polo's descriptions point to an advanced, self-sustaining civilization, with architectural and societal structures more refined than war-driven Mongol stereotypes would suggest. In this interpretation, the Mongols were not simply barbaric invaders. They were caretakers or inheritors of a much older, more complex society. Another figure often cited is Catherine the Great of Russia. Her reign in the 18th century marked a turning point in Russia's historical narrative. Under her leadership, massive efforts were undertaken to modernize and Europeanize Russian culture, including the rewriting of historical records and the restructuring of Russia's territorial identities. Some theorists claim that Catherine's scholars deliberately obscured the Tartarian past, breaking it into digestible, controllable fragments that aligned better with her imperial ambitions. A mysterious cartographer named Joseph Nicholas Delisle also enters the frame. An astronomer and mapmaker in the 18th century, Delisle was invited to Russia to lead scientific expeditions and assist in the creation of more accurate maps. His early maps featured Tartary prominently, but later editions saw the term vanish almost entirely. Was this simply a reflection of changing geographic nomenclature, or evidence of historical redaction? Then there are the so-called mud flood events, often cited in connection with Tartaria, particularly the 1812 fire of Moscow and the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia. Some proponents argue that these were not natural disasters or isolated catastrophes, but coordinated efforts or side effects of technologies capable of erasing or burying entire cities. Photographs of buildings partially submerged in earth, particularly in cities like St. Petersburg or Chicago, are presented as evidence of an advanced Tartarian architecture, buried, literally, by a cataclysm lost to history. Finally, there's the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Celebrated as a marvel of human achievement, the fair's classical architecture was supposedly built in less than 2 years, only to be demolished shortly after. Skeptics argue the structures were not built for the event, but remnants of Tartarian civilization disguised as new builds and then destroyed to eliminate remaining traces. Each of these individuals and events offers a glimpse into a narrative just beneath the surface, one where history isn't written by the victors, but rewritten by those with the power to decide what gets remembered and what gets buried. Supporters of the Tartaria theory point to a patchwork of compelling clues, photographs, maps, architectural anomalies, and historical inconsistencies as the backbone of their claims. These fragments of evidence are scattered across centuries, continents, and disciplines, yet believers argue they tell a unified story, that a technologically advanced global civilization once existed, and that it was intentionally hidden or destroyed. One of the most commonly cited pillars of Tartarian evidence is the architecture. All over the world, from Istanbul to San Francisco, there exist buildings with anachronistic grandeur, structures with domes, spires, and arches far too sophisticated, some argue, for the period and cultures attributed with constructing them. These buildings often fall under what is broadly called Greco-Roman or neoclassical architecture. But Tartaria theorists see something different, the remnants of a single advanced culture with its own aesthetic and engineering principles. Cities like St. Petersburg, Kazan, and even Chicago are said to contain examples of Tartarian architecture, structures allegedly built before their official founding dates, and thus too advanced or too large to have been constructed with the tools and timeframes conventional history accepts. Another point of contention lies in old maps. Maps from the 16th to 18th centuries clearly label massive regions as Tartary, or Grand Tartaria. These regions span much of Asia and even dip into Europe, yet vanish from maps and textbooks by the 19th century. Believers ask why a landmass once so prominent could disappear so thoroughly without an accompanying historical explanation. Some theorists even claim that antique globes and encyclopedias, including early editions of Encyclopedia Britannica, describe Tartary as a functioning empire well into the 18th century, suggesting that the erasure was sudden and deliberate. Technology is another major theme. Photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s showing massive buildings, intricate power stations, and what appear to be electric tram systems in cities considered undeveloped at the time are flagged as evidence. How, believers ask, could these cities host such advanced infrastructure with limited modern tools and resources? The suggestion is that this technology wasn't built by those civilizations. It was inherited from the Tartarians. Some even go further, arguing that free energy systems, possibly based on atmospheric electricity, were utilized by Tartaria. Ornate towers and antenna-like spires atop old buildings are reinterpreted not as decorative, but functional, perhaps part of an ancient power grid. Linguistic inconsistencies, too, fuel the theory. Place names, titles, and cultural references that seem to appear suddenly or shift dramatically are taken as evidence of manipulated history. Why do so many countries have similar architectural symbols, despite allegedly having no contact with one another? Why do myths and legends across different continents speak of sky gods, great floods, or vanished Golden Age civilizations? Tartaria theorists don't claim to have every answer, but they argue that these unexplained remnants, the oversized architecture, the vanished names, the abrupt historical gaps, aren't isolated oddities. They're breadcrumbs, leading back to a past much stranger and perhaps more advanced than we've been led to believe. Analyzing the core evidence behind the Tartaria theory requires separating verifiable fact from interpretive speculation. While proponents argue that the clues form a cohesive narrative of a lost global civilization, many of the claims rest on reinterpretations of historical artifacts, not on definitive proof. Let's take a closer look at these pillars and examine how they stand up to scrutiny. Let's begin with the architectural argument. Tartaria theorists point to grand neoclassical buildings found in cities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas as evidence of an advanced civilization. While the scale and elegance of these structures are undeniable, historians and architects offer more grounded explanations. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a resurgence of classical architecture known as the neoclassical movement, inspired by the rediscovery of Greco-Roman styles during the Renaissance. These buildings, impressive as they are, often took decades to complete, were funded by empires and industrial capitalists, and employed large labor forces, not mysterious, vanished technologies. Many of the photos cited by Tartaria supporters, showing buildings partially buried in earth or seemingly out of scale with their surroundings, are often explained by changes in urban development over time. The mud flood phenomenon, in which streets appear to be built over previous ground levels, is often the result of rising city infrastructure, sedimentation, or the rebuilding of roads after fires or floods. Cities like Chicago, for instance, underwent literal elevation projects in the 19th century to improve drainage, explaining why some buildings appear sunken from modern street view. The old maps that label regions as Tartary are indeed real. However, historians clarify that Tartary was a catch-all term used by Europeans to describe the vast and largely unknown territories of Central and Northern Asia, much like the term Orient was used for the East. It didn't refer to a specific political or cultural entity. As geographic knowledge improved and Russian imperial expansion absorbed these regions, the term fell out of use, part of the natural evolution of cartographic language, not necessarily a deliberate erasure. As for the technology claims, photos of early electrical systems and electric trams in the late 19th century, these are well-documented innovations. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and many others were advancing electrical engineering during that time. The presence of tram systems, electric streetlights, and ornate public buildings in growing cities is consistent with the technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution. Even the ornate spires that some theorists label as antennas or components of a lost energy system have practical architectural explanations. These features were often lightning rods, symbolic towers, or simple design flourishes, not parts of forgotten energy grids. The resemblance to modern communication technology is largely coincidental and speculative. This is not to say all mysteries are solved. Old maps can be inconsistent. Historical records are often shaped by the biases of those in power, but when subjected to careful scrutiny, the core Tartarian evidence tends to lean more toward misunderstood context, misinterpreted visuals, and symbolic embellishment than suppressed truth. Still, for some, the unexplained gaps and curious patterns remain too persistent to dismiss outright. Skepticism surrounding the Tartaria theory is widespread, especially among historians, archaeologists, and architects. While believers see a pattern of suppressed history and lost civilizations, critics argue that the theory is built on misinterpretations, cherry-picked data, and a misunderstanding of how history is documented and preserved. From this perspective, the allure of Tartaria lies more in modern distrust of institutions than in hard evidence of a forgotten empire. One of the primary criticisms levied against the Tartaria theory is its lack of cohesive archaeological proof. No verified texts, tools, or ruins have ever been discovered that conclusively point to a unified, technologically advanced civilization called Tartaria. Unlike ancient civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley, which left behind extensive written records, artifacts, and clearly datable structures, Tartaria lacks this empirical foundation. Skeptics argue that if such a global empire had existed, its remnants would be far more apparent and subject to rigorous academic study, not relegated to fringe YouTube channels and alternative history forums. Critics also point to the flexible, often contradictory nature of the theory itself. Tartaria is described simultaneously as a hidden empire, a global civilization, a spiritual utopia, and the source of forbidden technology, sometimes all at once. This lack of a consistent narrative, scholars say, makes it difficult to test the theory against factual evidence. The more fluid the idea becomes, the harder it is to disprove, allowing believers to adapt the theory to fit any new contradiction or counterpoint. In academic terms, this renders Tartaria unfalsifiable, a hallmark of pseudoscience. Historical linguists and cartographers push back on the idea that the word Tartary referred to a single unified culture. They emphasize that European mapmakers lacking precise knowledge of Asia's interior used generalized labels. Tartary was a placeholder, much like terra incognita or darkest Africa, applied not out of conspiracy but ignorance. As exploration and colonization filled in these gaps, the terminology evolved accordingly. To historians, the disappearance of Tartary from maps is evidence of progress in knowledge, not suppression. Architectural experts, too, have weighed in. They argue that the buildings held up as Tartarian monuments, cathedrals, government buildings, exposition halls, are easily traceable through construction records, blueprints, and period photographs. The claim that these structures were inherited from a mysterious prior civilization, critics say, ignores well-documented human labor, known architects, and recorded budgets. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, for example, is a frequent focal point in the theory, yet architectural historians have published extensive documentation on how its temporary buildings were constructed using plaster and wood facades, designed to impress, not endure. Psychologists also offer insight. They suggest that the Tartaria theory taps into a broader cultural phenomenon, the desire to find hidden truths in a world increasingly shaped by disinformation, rapid technological change, and distrust of authority. In this light, Tartaria becomes less about the past and more about the present, a symbol of what might have been, had truth not been manipulated. Still, despite the critiques and contradictions, the theory persists. It thrives on the very skepticism that discredits it, turning doubt into fuel. For its followers, the absence of proof isn't a flaw. It's a sign of just how deep the cover-up goes. The Tartaria conspiracy isn't merely about lost maps or buried buildings. It's about the way we interpret the world and our place in it. On a cultural level, the theory taps into a growing sentiment that modern civilization, with all its complexities, disconnection, and disillusionment, may have lost something essential, something forgotten or taken. As a result, Tartaria becomes more than a hypothetical empire. It becomes a symbol of a purer, more advanced, and possibly more spiritual past that stands in contrast to the chaotic present. In an age where institutional trust is steadily eroding, where governments, media, and academic authorities are routinely questioned, Tartaria resonates with those seeking alternative narratives. The theory offers an alluring premise that our history has been intentionally rewritten, that knowledge is hoarded, and that the world as we know it is a pale imitation of what once was. It's a cultural rebellion cloaked in historical speculation. For many, believing in Tartaria is not just about curiosity, it's a rejection of the dominant worldview. Politically, the theory appeals to those disenchanted with globalization and centralized power. In Tartaria, some see a decentralized and harmonious world order that predated modern empires. It aligns, perhaps coincidentally, with modern populist sentiments that question elite control, surveillance, and manipulation. This sense of disenfranchisement gives rise to a historical yearning, a belief that the common people were once part of something greater, and that knowledge of that greatness was stripped away to keep them compliant. Socially, the implications are complex. On one hand, the Tartaria theory fosters community. Online forums, social media groups, and video channels are brimming with amateur researchers, digital archaeologists, and curious minds pooling their findings. This shared endeavor, while often speculative, cultivates collaboration and grassroots inquiry in an era of increasing social atomization. But on the other hand, the theory can also contribute to the erosion of critical thinking. The same democratization of information that empowers citizen researchers also blurs the line between informed skepticism and wholesale rejection of expertise. When all narratives are viewed as equally suspect and all counter-evidence is dismissed as part of a cover-up, the door opens to deeper forms of conspiratorial thinking, sometimes leading adherents down even darker paths. Tartaria also dovetails with the aesthetic and spiritual revival movements seen in modern culture. There's an entire subculture online centered around antiquitech, reset theories, and free energy, inspired by the supposed remnants of Tartarian knowledge. These beliefs echo older philosophical ideas that technology and spirituality were once united, that humanity has fallen from a golden age, and that recovering ancient wisdom is key to restoring balance. Even in art and design, echoes of Tartaria are emerging. Fashion, architecture, and digital aesthetics now mimic the ornate, symmetrical, and otherworldly elements associated with the lost empire. The mystery of Tartaria becomes a canvas, one onto which people project hope, nostalgia, or rebellion. Ultimately, Tartaria is not just a historical question. It's a cultural mirror. It reflects not only what people suspect about the past, but what they long for in the future. A world less artificial, more meaningful, and filled with hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. The influence of the Tartaria conspiracy has gradually seeped from obscure internet forums into mainstream consciousness, shaping the way some people engage with history, architecture, and media narratives. What began as a niche curiosity has evolved into a broader cultural phenomenon, subtly influencing content creation, storytelling tropes, and public discourse surrounding history and institutional trust. In digital spaces, particularly YouTube and TikTok, the Tartaria theory has taken on a life of its own. Short-form videos dissecting old photographs, exploring mud flood basements, or comparing architectural similarities between distant cities rack up millions of views. These platforms have created echo chambers where skepticism of mainstream history is encouraged, often without the checks and balances of academic rigor. Here, mystery is entertainment, and the more it challenges accepted narratives, the more it thrives. Mainstream media has also begun to take notice, albeit cautiously. Documentaries and docuseries touching on hidden histories or forbidden knowledge often flirt with Tartarian themes without explicitly naming them. Shows on streaming platforms explore ancient technology, lost civilizations, and unexplained monuments, drawing in viewers hungry for stories that deviate from textbook timelines. Tartaria doesn't need to be mentioned by name. Its motifs, questions, and atmosphere are all present. The theory has also inspired a wave of speculative fiction and alternate history in literature, video games, and film. Games like Assassin's Creed and Civilization feature narratives involving secret histories, ancient empires, and lost technologies. These aren't directly tied to Tartaria, but they echo the same foundational idea, that what we've been taught is a selective, incomplete version of the truth. Independent creators on platforms like Substack and YouTube have launched serialized novels, graphic essays, and digital comics inspired by Tartarian aesthetics and lore, blending steampunk, post-apocalyptic, and historical fantasy elements. In the world of architecture and urban exploration, the theory has sparked renewed interest in overlooked historical buildings. Some urban explorers now frame their work through a Tartarian lens, treating abandoned courthouses, rail stations, and mansions as possible remnants of the lost empire. These expeditions aren't just physical, they're digital as well, with Instagram pages and blogs dedicated to Tartarian finds, where ornate facades and impossibly intricate stonework are reinterpreted as relics of forgotten knowledge. Tartaria's influence even touches the educational conversation. Homeschooling communities and alternative education platforms have begun offering courses or content that question mainstream historical narratives, sometimes including references to Tartaria or similar lost civilizations. For some parents and educators skeptical of standardized curricula, the theory serves as a gateway into broader conversations about who writes history and why. But perhaps the most significant impact of Tartaria is how it reframes authority and narrative control. In a time when institutional trust is fractured, the theory provides a framework, albeit a speculative one, for understanding how information might be manipulated, lost, or rewritten. Whether or not people believe in Tartaria as a literal empire, the idea that history is selective and that truth is often buried beneath layers of interpretation is now a widespread sentiment. And that sentiment, in many ways, may be the true legacy of the Tartarian narrative. Venturing into the fringes of the Tartaria theory reveals a realm where speculation eclipses conventional logic, and boundaries between history, metaphysics, and science fiction blur. These perspectives are not simply extensions of the theory's core ideas. They're departures into an entirely different worldview, where Tartaria is no longer just a lost civilization, but a keystone in a cosmic or dimensional puzzle. One of the more unconventional claims suggests that Tartaria was not merely an ancient civilization, but part of a pre-reset world, an earlier iteration of human society before a global cataclysm reset our timeline. In this view, events like the so-called mud flood or mysterious celestial disasters were not isolated phenomena, but markers of cyclical destruction and rebirth. Tartaria, according to this narrative, existed in the Old World, a technologically and spiritually advanced society that mastered free energy, unified architecture, and possibly even forms of consciousness manipulation. The current world, then, is seen as a degraded echo of what once was. Related to this is the idea that Tartaria's supposed technologies were not mechanical in the way we understand them, but resonant, using vibration, frequency, and harmonic design. Buildings are said to have been constructed not just for function, but to channel energy, enhance well-being, and even communicate with celestial forces. The grand domes, symmetrical towers, and antenna-like spires seen on old cathedrals and civic buildings are interpreted as parts of a global frequency network, one that once provided free energy, healing, or atmospheric balance. This aligns with fringe theories around orgone energy, sacred geometry, and ancient vibrational technologies. Others take it further still, suggesting Tartaria was not of Earth at all. Some theorists link it to the idea of a hidden race or non-human civilization, an advanced species that either lived among humans or ruled from behind the scenes. These ideas intersect with hollow Earth theories, where vast underground realms house remnants of pre-human intelligence. In this interpretation, Tartaria is either the surface expression of an inner world or an offshoot of extraterrestrial colonization, with its knowledge suppressed to maintain current power structures. A particularly strange offshoot connects Tartaria to time manipulation. Influenced by alternative interpretations of the Gregorian calendar reform and missing time theory, some fringe researchers suggest that centuries of history have been artificially inserted or deleted to obscure the truth. The phantom time hypothesis, which proposes that entire chunks of the Middle Ages were fabricated, dovetails with the Tartarian claim that our historical timeline has been artificially compressed or altered to erase knowledge of this global civilization. Then there are the esoteric spiritual interpretations. Tartaria, in this context, represents a higher vibrational society, one aligned with natural law, divine order, or ancient wisdom lost in the modern age. Its erasure isn't just physical or historical, but symbolic, a collective forgetting of humanity's potential and spiritual sovereignty. From this perspective, rediscovering Tartaria isn't about ruins or blueprints, but awakening a dormant truth buried within human consciousness. These speculative angles might seem outrageous, but they fuel the theory's enduring mystery. In Tartaria, believers don't just see a forgotten empire. They see the ghost of a different reality, one that hints at what we might have been, or could become. As we reach the end of our journey into the mystery of Tartaria, what remains isn't a simple answer, but a set of deeper questions. about history, power, and the nature of truth itself. We began with old maps bearing unfamiliar names, vanished civilizations hinted at in architectural relics, and photographs that seemed to defy the official timeline. We examined how a civilization, once labeled and documented, could be erased so thoroughly, and why that possibility still resonates so strongly today. We explored the historical and political context, how empire building and centralized control over information may have contributed to the disappearance of Tartaria from official narratives. Key figures like Catherine the Great and events like the World's Fairs were framed not just as cultural milestones, but as moments where history might have been reshaped or concealed. We dissected the core claims: grand architecture with no clear origin, maps that raise more questions than they answer, and technology that seemed to appear before its time. And yet, when examined under the light of critical scrutiny, many of these claims revealed more conventional explanations: contextual oversights, architectural trends, and evolving language, rather than hidden empires. Still, the allure of Tartaria persists. It lives in the gaps, the anomalies, and the coincidences that official history doesn't always explain to satisfaction. It thrives in the fertile ground of modern skepticism, where doubt in institutional authority has created space for alternative interpretations of our shared past. We also explored its broader cultural impact. From viral videos to speculative fiction, Tartaria has become a lens through which people reinterpret not just history, but reality itself. It reflects a deeper need to believe that something greater once existed, an age when humanity lived in harmony with knowledge, nature, and perhaps even the cosmos. And then we ventured into the fringes, where Tartaria becomes more than a lost civilization. It becomes a metaphysical cipher, a remnant of another timeline, a signal from a forgotten golden age. Whether as energy technology, spiritual order, or the victim of a cosmic reset, Tartaria represents the hope that our world could be, and once was, something much more profound. But maybe that's the real power of Tartaria, not as a concrete civilization etched in stone, but as a cultural mythos, a story that challenges us to question, to look closer, to wonder, and perhaps to rethink what else in our past might have been misfiled, misnamed, or intentionally obscured. In the end, the truth about Tartaria might not lie in ruins or maps, but in the stories we tell about the past and what those stories say about us now. Thanks for tuning in to the Conspiracy Files podcast. We're here with brand new episodes every Wednesday. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to follow us and be sure to rate, review, and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. You can also reach out anytime by emailing us at contact@theconspiracyfilespodcast.com. Until next time, and remember, the truth is out there. If you enjoyed this episode and want to dive deeper into the world of conspiracy theories, consider subscribing for exclusive access to the material they don't want you to hear. As a subscriber, you'll get banned episodes, episodes deemed too controversial for mainstream platforms, members-only bonus episodes, not available anywhere else, extended director's cut versions of your favorite episodes, early access to new content before it's released to the public, and much more. Thank you for your support. The link is in the description below. Join now.